The night at Tory Jean's passed like a thin scratch on the placid surface of Fairmont Crest. But it was that scratch that opened the door to everything plastered with habit and pretense. Leslie stood in the warm yellow light of the cafe, where the smell of burnt coffee and melted butter on toast made people feel tender, and witnessed something she was never prepared for. The intimate conversation between Ted and June, an intimacy that was not exactly love but more like an invisible orbit drawing them together like a habit from a previous life. The small cluster of rings placed between two glasses of water, a silver light scratched across the darkness, became a mark engraved in Leslie's memory, awakening in her scattered memories that she had long ago collected and sealed like a notebook she never wanted to open. In that moment, jealousy didn't explode with a bang, but rose like a tide, slow, viscous, filling every crevice in her chest. And with it came the cold realization that she had been standing too long at the edge of the story, where the light never reached far enough to see what was happening. For Leslie, the moment revealed a side of Ted she had never seen before. A softening, a strange patience, a listening gaze she thought was reserved for her only on stormy days. For June, the ring cluster was like a seed of broken memory. Where the past refused to rest in family was no longer a single roof, but a hastily bandaged wound made by promises no one dared to look directly at. From that indifferent situation, a truth emerged like a sharp blade from its sheath. They were blood. Not a vague suggestion, not a fragile consolation, but a closed chain of facts leading to a cold piece of DNA paper. A match. The shock that hit Ted did not explode into anger immediately. It circled through memory, sloshing through the gaps of childhood, hitting the walls of old answers and then rebounding, tightening his throat and using the only language he could, action. His anger became a journey, a red line that started with Tory Jean, wound through the town records offices, dove into the musty shelves of the old hospital, passed between the half-concluded statements of retired staff, rummaged through baptismal records and birth records, and traced the years stolen by a hand that had arranged everything with the cruel patience of one who knew time would do the dirty work. Meanwhile, June was drawn into another spiral, not to find fault with anyone but to measure herself to see how much faith she could still place in a new definition of herself. When one fine day she suddenly became the daughter of a man who had stood waiting in the hospital hallway, then disappeared as if he had never existed, and the sister of a man with whom she had only a few days before cautiously exchanged small talk about work and the weather did I end the days that followed, Leslie let jealousy guide her, silently following Ted's every step as if his silhouette was the only map that could show her the way to safety. She relearned the habits of a hunter, remembering the hours, the stops, the faces that appeared repeatedly around him, the phone calls he quickly ended, the envelopes he hastily hid under the covers of books. What she clung to was no longer the hope of reconciliation but the fear of being redundant to a truth that did not need her to survive. June, even with their seemingly innocuous conversation, couldn't escape the haunting thought that she was about to become the bearer of an abandoned oath. An oath belonging to some family that had promised never to let her go again. Ted turned back to Tory Jean again and again, telling himself it was just habit, trying to find her train of thought. But in his eyes and June's, a zone of empathy formed that they both knew wasn't forbidden affection, nor temporary confusion, but the indescribable bond that two lives find themselves tied together by a long severed string that someone had now tied, clumsily and too tightly. The tension escalated like a thermometer placed before a lamp, and late one afternoon, Leslie walked into the bar, closing the door behind her as if closing off any avenues of escape. No words came out, only small movements. Hands clenched, shoulders slumped, eyes slackened, glasses pushed askew, rings turned slightly toward the light. The accusations lay in the eyes, tears crept down her cheeks like an undeniable signature, and silence became the common language for all three of them. In that moment, Leslie understood that there were truths that she did not need to prove, only that she needed to accept that she had been in the wrong position for too long. Ted understood that his anger had found a target. Not the flesh and blood person before him, but a system of cruel decisions signed with a pseudonym in good faith. June knew that the circle of her life was about to be redrawn, and every choice from now on would have to pass through the narrow door of a connection that no one asked for but required the courage not to lose herself. Then came the day Ted decided to tell June the whole truth, no longer with hints but with a chain of facts he had dissected to exhaustion. Birth records with altered times, newborn wristbands switched during a power outage, a donation to the hospital fund that matched that time, and an old witness who confused the past and present but still remembered the smell of antiseptic on a rainy night. He chose a seemingly safe place to tell it, the church archives with thick books that smelled of old paper, thinking that there the footsteps of the world would not intrude. But Fairmont Crest was a town that knew how to keep secrets, and those secrets also knew how to leak out. Leslie, in the habit of someone with nothing to lose but the truth, had stood in the hallway behind the room, accidentally hearing enough fragments to understand that everything about her was about to be redefined in a way she didn't want. The feeling of being left out of the loop rose in her like a fever, but strangely, the fever opened a small window of sanity. If it was all real, if the cluster of rings was the final piece of a staged sequence, then her enemy had never been June, and it wasn't really Ted. The enemy was the invisible hand that pushed everyone into its role like an old director who could only repeat the switch to hide some greater fear. She left before the end, not because she was weak, but because she knew that someday she would have to return with undeniable proof. And when that happened, anger would be the only weapon she trusted. Ted and June's quest then expanded beyond the private sphere, reaching into the town's hidden orders. Each rung of the file ladder opened into another room, where people learned to smile as they signed papers that would remove a child from one name and place him in another. The old hospital, now a community center, retained its never-renovated basement, where a rusted metal cabinet, if pulled just right, would pop out a side compartment. A retired church warden told of donations during the rainy season, when the floods came and the lights flickered, as if all evil plans liked to take shelter in the storm. A young lawyer volunteered to review notarized copies and accidentally found duplicate signatures in 2 sets of files 19 years apart. Each discovery restructures Ted's memory, forcing him into uncomfortable questions. Who he was before he knew the truth, who he loved when he didn't know the truth, and who he will become after the truth has run its course. June, meanwhile, tries to recount the losses that have yet to be named. A childhood without a mother, a youth with blind spots no one will talk about, a present suddenly cramped when her name brings with it a family name, an anonymous debt, and a look of pity she hates more than judgment. Leslie stands outside, but never looks away. She becomes the minute keeper of the darkness, sifting through rumors, counting the footsteps of the errand boys for the big families, and stitching together a map that points to a specific name, the one who turned children into words on paper as if they were property in exchange. Fairmont Crest regulates its volume like any place that keeps a secret. People talk louder about the weather to whisper less about secret rendezvous. People turn up the music at parties so whispers don't leak through the walls. But under the fresh coat of paint of those alternative stories is a network of cracks that are now counted, named, and marked. June and Ted, from 2 halves of strangers, tied together by the uninvited letter of blood, become a force that distorts other trajectories. Long-standing relationships based on assumptions are skewed, commitments that once seemed eternal suddenly fragile when they collide with the reality of blood. They don't promise victory, don't demand glory. They doggedly follow the path that the DNA paper has drawn, a path so full of potholes that you can only go slowly and look carefully at your feet. Leslie, standing at the crossroads, finally accepts that she must rewrite her stance against the wind. If she clings to anger, she will turn to stone. If she lets go, she will be swept away. She had no choice but to turn anger into will, jealousy into the ability to read traces, and loss into a new kind of discipline so as not to lose the rare goodness that remained in her. She began by looking at the history of donations to the local health fund, linking them to mistimed births, attaching rumors of a nurse who disappeared after receiving a cash payment, and discovering coincidences that could not be dismissed as coincidental when she gave the match to Ted, not to win him back, but to repay a silent debt of truth to the one who had held her hand through the darkest seasons. Ted saw her for the first time not as someone left behind, but as an ally learning to walk upright again. When the gates of truth were opened, one could no longer pretend they had never existed. Parties had extra uninvited guests. Closed-door meetings had extra chairs for secrets about to be named. Evening prayers had extra silence for lost souls. No one knew where the destination would be. A trial, a public apology, or a secret agreement to push everything back into the darkness. But everyone knew there was no going back to the hidden table in Tori Jean's corner where the darkness had been thick enough to blind. June began visiting the old caretaker every afternoon, copying the mold-swollen ledgers as if rewriting her own biography. Ted closed the ring box and put it in the unlocked drawer as a reminder that some rings were meant to be looked at, not worn. Leslie made a habit of walking across the square, counting the church bells to her heart rate, and each time they tolled, she tried to forgive a small part of the past, not because anyone deserved it, but because she needed room to breathe. The new order of Fairmont Crest began to take shape in its own unpleasant way. Favors, compromises, odd-hour appointments, misdirected envelopes that ended up right there, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, internal audit reports leaked on the morning someone was tired. Like a sunken stone in a lake, the last ripples lingered long after one had left the shore. And in those ripples, the anger had worn away its sharp edges, revealing the hard cores of three people forced to redefine themselves. June chose legitimacy without asking for permission, Ted chose perseverance without adulation, and Leslie chose dignity without reward. When night fell again on Tori Jean, yellow light still poured over the table where the ring cluster had once lain. But now the silence was no longer a cover for deception but a pause between rounds, where foreheads were dried, wounds were bound, and the next round was prepared with eyes more accustomed to the darkness and hearts that had learned to beat without miracles. Because at Fairmont Crest, one doesn't win by banging, one survives by counting the cracks, naming them, keeping them in view, and moving forward, however slowly, however painfully, until the truth is no longer a fallen stone, but new ground to stand on. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. All the content I make is just speculation and personal sharing. If you find the video interesting and useful, please support me with a like and leave a comment. If you have better ideas or more interesting speculations, please share them in the comments section for everyone to discuss. I appreciate all your contributions and support. Sincerely, thank you.